Wonderful, kind words. As they say, only my mother would have believed everything that you heard, if she had heard it. Yeah? When I was coming here, I thought I had a nice script, and I was well prepared for what I would say to you today. But having been here for a little while, I feel the need to digress from my script immediately. And I want to start off with a confession, and maybe more than one confession to start off. As I look at this group out here, I must admit that I have a sense of nervousness. And I've addressed many groups before, but yet I acknowledge that when I see so many youngsters, eager, enthusiastic, I sense nervousness bordering on trepidation. Yeah? There is yet another confession which I need to make, and that's about the topic itself. When I heard what was planned for the rest of the day, I think I would have been more appropriate on that side and not here, because I might have had more to learn through the course of the day than I might have to share with you. So that's my second confession. And as if this wasn't enough, when I came in here I heard, and I wish I had realized this even earlier, because the truth is that Dr. Murthy had sent me the background of this seminar, in which he had actually mentioned the fact that there was a workshop which had been conducted on this subject. And like many other things, I've again shown a weakness on my part for not having paid attention to the detail which was involved, and I didn't reflect deeply about it. And I'm going to rue that, because as Dr. Murthy just told me, that the purpose of that workshop was to make sure that this group is intellectually ready to deal and tackle with a subject of this order. Now maybe you are and I'm not. That makes it a very uneven battle and an uneven engagement at this moment. Now, I could go on and on, but the issue is as if this wasn't bad enough. What I'm most nervous about is the fact that I'm going to be standing here and Dr. Murthy is sitting there. 20 years ago, I was sitting in the audience like many of you, and I cannot tell you how I respected Dr. Murthy for what he taught us, for what he did to us, how he shaped us. And respect is a word I use now. When I was in the institute, I would have used a word like awe. So we were in awe of what he did and what he said and the value which he added to us. So I'm in considerable fear at this stage, because he will be just as sharp as he was then and haul me up for any impropriety or anything incorrect that I might say at this stage, and that's my other fear at this moment. Now, after so many confessions, many of you must be wondering, what sort of a fool is this guy who had so many concerns and he yet stands up out here and to talk about a subject like this. All I can say is it's yet again a reflection of my having acted before thinking. And when I think about it, 20 years ago when I joined Hindustan Unilever, my first boss had given me this feedback. That 20 years later, I have the reason to get the same feedback. Not only says that I'm impetuous and I act without thinking, it also tells me that I'm a very poor learner. I haven't made any difference over the last 20 years. The only saving grace in all of this is that while I have an audience which might not be very indulgent as I go along, thankfully my boss is not here, because if he was, I might possibly not have continued doing all that I am doing today after hearing what I might have to say and hearing all the failings which I have just talked to you about. So that's the only saving grace. But I'm here and so are you. I don't know which one of us I need to feel more sorry about, because of my having to talk to you or you having to endure me for the next hour or so. Be that as it may, I'm going to boldly venture in a space which I haven't gone before and ignore the sage advice given by many people who once who said that at times it's better to stay quiet and let people wonder if you're a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. So I'm about to do that in front of you all. Yeah? And if you wondered why I was carrying on with these little talk, There were really two reasons. One is I don't have enough content to fill an hour on the subject of consolidation. And the two is, when I walked in here, I realized my computer wasn't here and I didn't know what button to press in order to get to the next chart which I am in. So now I find that my computer is here and the mouse isn't. Can I press this and it will work? Yeah?
Down everything.
Yeah, that's fine. I can handle that. Yeah? Thank you. So, enough of this loose and trivial banter before we begin. Let me start off on this subject. And the first chart will give you an indication that all of what I said wasn't just small talk. The fact that I started off thinking about this subject in terms of what does it mean? When I was asked to talk on this subject, the fact that I needed to even refer to the Oxford Dictionary must give you some indication how little I knew about this subject. So the Oxford Dictionary defines consolidation in terms like this: to do things which will make the firm, make things firm or secure, to strengthen, to bring together in a single whole or a system, and to form a solid mass or a whole. That's really how the Oxford Dictionary defines the word consolidate. What I want to do is to take this word and talk about the implications of this in the business context and what it means for us. And all of you who have spent a long time talking about this in a workshop don't need to spend more than a few seconds to recognize that in the context of business, the word consolidation is often referred to for mergers, acquisitions, and by definition, when you talk of a merger or an acquisition, by corollary, you are also including disposals, because one person's acquisition is another person's disposals. There are many, many dimensions of mergers, acquisitions, and disposals which go along with it, and hopefully through the course of the next 40-45 minutes, I'm going to give you some sense of other aspects of consolidation, not as fashionable, not as talked about, but consolidation using the same sets of principles which are involved, which can work for us. Now the merits of consolidation are easy to understand, and irrespective of who does what, at what stage, and what form of consolidation, merger or acquisition goes in, whether overtly stated or not, the primary driver of all business decision is to find ways by which he could enhance shareholder value. Creating economic value is the primary driver of what we do, and there will be many, many models which will exist in terms of how value is created. This is just one of them. And I think the key point here is not for me to talk about all aspects of value creation out here, but suffice to say that consolidation or mergers, acquisition touches many, many levers of value creation, and it is for this reason that it is talked about in such great detail. There is so much time, effort, and energy spent about the strategic initiative around acquisitions and mergers. While that might have been a very complex chart, and the reason I moved very quickly from it is because I don't understand that well enough. However, what I do understand as a very simple mind which looks at what happens in business is really saying, whatever the model you take, in the end, any form of consolidation must lead to two forms of synergies, as I call it, either cost synergies or revenue synergies. Cost synergies are what you call economies of scale. Revenue synergies are what I call economies of scope. Yeah. Cost synergies are the ones which we often talk about, the ones which we are referred to most often, and usually the drivers of a large number of things that we do. Whether it is to get in scale benefits, reducing unit costs of production, increasing your competitiveness, whichever way you define it, a large part of what you talk about comes around through cost synergies. But revenue synergies is just as strategic. Very often consolidation, acquisitions, mergers can allow you an entry and an opportunity to get into a new geography, a new product category, to get new capabilities and access to new technologies, capabilities, science, which will enhance what your business can do today. Revenue synergy is a case of making 1 + 1 = 3. Cost synergy is a case of making 10 + 10 = 15. That's really the difference between these two models, and both of them exist as we move forward. Again, both leading to creation of value for our consumers. And it is, if you trace the history of the last many years, you will find that the level of this activity has gone up quite sharply, from just under 1 trillion of this activity in the year 2000 or 1995 to over 3 trillion worth of such deals happening by the year 2000. And the drivers of all of this, again, I will move very quickly because this is a large amount of theory, and I don't think you need to spend any more time on this. For reasons which are obvious to all of us, as the white spaces, as we call it, reduced, as penetration and consumption and basic market development got over, organic growth slowed down, globalization allowed for easy flow of capital, people and information, availability of capital, risk finance, financial engineering, and the maturity of stock markets, which led to high valuation, allowing people to structure deals, not using cash and reducing the one limitation which people assumed which could come in the way of this, which was the availability of cash. All of this led to a situation when there was a very dramatic increase in the rate of such deals taking place across borders. However, as everything else, things change. The interesting thing in the year 2000 was that just after that period, we saw this activity coming down. Now, you don't have to be as old as I am. For many of you, you would recognize what was the event which took place in the year 2000, 2001. Can anyone tell me what happened which could have led to a situation like this? Sorry? No. It was the internet boom which was there, which had led to very, very high valuations which existed, where people believed value could be created out of virtually nothing. Collapsed. And there was a new reality which dawned, which led to new sets of valuation, and of course many other things happened, which made people question their ability to create value through the deals which they were structuring at that point in time. And after that, gradually again we've seen this thing going up. I would hazard to say that if we were to look at it 1 or 2 or 3 years later, you might once again see reductions which take place. And all this is really saying that human behavior follows certain patterns. When you have long periods when everything goes well, you become overly optimistic. Sometimes judgment gets clouded. You push the boundary of what is right, push the boundaries of what works, and then you have some fall. And then you recorrect, you find a new base, and life starts all over again. And this history of mergers, acquisitions across the world follows a pattern no differently from that. The interesting thing is, and most of you would have spent a lot of time seeing the strategic and the economic rationale for why we should have for activities like this. The truth is, despite the high intensity acquisitions which have been going on, and by no mistake have they started in the 90s, they've been going on for the last 50, 60, 70 years. Ever since industry has been around, they've been going on and increasing in intensity. The truth is, despite all the reasons why there must be more and more of these mergers and acquisitions, recent studies, not even recent studies, all studies done by a large number of players have some very revealing facts. And the revealing facts are, and this lists down all the different people who've carried out studies over the last many, many decades. And the two on the right are more recent studies which talked about how between 70 to 80% of all mergers and acquisitions destroy value. They were designed to create economic value, and between 70 to 80% of all deals destroy value. Now, it would be legitimate for many of us to reflect and say, despite the very strong strategic cases which are articulated, despite the strategic rationale which has been talked about, what goes wrong? Why is it that you end up in a situation like this? Now, the knowledge of this is important so that you can create safeguards. This by no means takes away from the case for consolidation whenever it's required. And if you sense in the conversation over what I share with you, more cases which I talk about where things have gone wrong, it is only to caution us that this is not a panacea for all our ills. This is not a panacea for all our problems. It is a key tool, a vital tool, a strategic tool, but a tool which needs to be handled with care. If handled incorrectly, it can lose value for us. What I wish to do is to start off with case studies. That's all the theory that I wanted to talk to you about. And I'm going to pick up a few marquee cases which had grabbed the attention of the world first, and talk to you about what went right, what went wrong, and my view in terms of what it could have been. I accept that because it's my judgment and my subjective view, people in the audience can have a different view, but that's fine. I will then move on to talking about Hindustan Unilever and a few cases. And when I'm talking on that, at least I'm on slightly firmer ground in terms of sharing with you what the thinking was when we went into and did what we did, and what the outcome was. Some worked well, some has not worked well, and if you find me talking about what's worked well, you must just pardon me, I'm a little biased when it comes to our company. Yeah? But let's stay with the first first case which I want to talk about, the AOL Time Warner. Most of you would remember both of these companies, but let me just state a few facts. AOL was a company which was a young upstart, come up in the internet age. Set up in 1992, it established revenues of 8 billion, was primarily an internet service provider, a little bit of e-commerce which it carried out, and you know what, had a market cap of 140 billion, significantly higher than Time Warner, which had been around for over 80 years, 30 billion in revenue, 6 billion in EBITDA, and a market cap of 110, 112. Two very strong and solid companies. And these two companies decided that it is time for us to get together because they believed that they could create a combination which was virtually unbeatable. And the reason they felt that it was an unbeatable combination was simply saying, imagine the power of two companies coming together. One of them owns content of the sorts which nobody else has, and the other one has access to the last mile. Imagine if you have the access to the consumer, imagine you have unbelievable content, and imagine the possibility of combining these two, creating packages which could lock in the consumer and create value long term. That in simple, this thing was the strategic rationale for this deal. Yeah. However, life wasn't as simple as this. Many things went wrong. And I think what happened subsequently was the fact that the internet bubble burst. When the internet bubble burst, there was an SEC investigation which was carried out, and we quickly discovered that there were accounting improprieties at AOL. 100 billion loss was reported 2 years within that event, largely linked to the goodwill, and AOL frankly had virtually all its cap was based on the goodwill which it had generated. There was really nothing else, and the entire board, including the CEO, had to be replaced by 2003. That's how disastrous the outcome of what seemed to be a marriage made in heaven. It seemed to be the perfect complementarity that you could think of. And now when I think about this, and again 2020 hindsight is a very wonderful thing, it's easy to see things later on, but if you now reflect, maybe with a little bit of wisdom, a little bit of due diligence, some of these at least should have been visible to people in advance. And think about where we were. Here were two companies, and if you just think about the two companies, the profile of the employees, the culture, the philosophy, you would see that there was a fundamental mismatch. AOL was a company of 20-somethings. If you were 30, you were a veteran. There were people who at the age of 25, 30 and the mid-30s were dollar millionaires with stock options which had been given to them, making money largely because of the internet boom. Here was a company, Time Warner, 80 years, conventional industry, had created content. The philosophy towards business was fundamentally different. Post this acquisition, whether we like it or not, it led to a situation where one company and a set of people felt that they were winners, the other felt that they were losers. Now, how do you integrate an organization when a large number of people feel that they've lost out and they were losers in this deal? The issue of losing critical people, and many people left, was not a trivial issue, and that's what happened. I think there were one or two things which were unfortunate. Nobody could have predicted that the internet bubble would have burst at that point in time, in that circumstance. But there were some strategic mistakes which were made. I think the belief that last mile connectivity coming out of modem technology which existed at that point in time, and not investing and not foreseeing what could happen with the advent of broadband and how it could make your business model obsolete and something else could come in, was possibly the one strategic mistake which AOL made. They did not make enough investment in that technology and the broadband as some others did. And finally, at a time when AOL was going strong, there was almost a belief that nothing would go wrong, and therefore the risk of hyping up what the future could be, projecting revenues, monetizing eyeballs and what could actually happen, led them to create a financial model which was not borne out as life went on. So it were a combination of these events which happened, which led to the disastrous outcomes which we saw afterwards. But this is not all. If this was the only case which was high profile, which didn't work, we didn't need to worry, because in any situation there would be a one-off error. There's a second case which is just as important, where things didn't work out as well as they should have. Daimler-Benz acquired Chrysler, and they did that in the year 1998 and paid just under $40 billion for that acquisition. And the rationale again is what I put down here. A complementarity in the product portfolio, the ability to leverage joint skills, the precision engineering coming from the German giant, the focus on design and styling which came in from Chrysler, the geographical complementarity and strengthening their positions both in Europe and in the United States where Chrysler was strong. There were many, many reasons which were articulated to say what this wonderful strategic fit of this acquisition was. But again, there were differences. And these differences were a little more subtle than the differences which existed between AOL and Time Warner. But the lack of cultural fit, once again, the German mindset and an American mindset is very, very different. Chrysler, over a period of time, started making huge losses. They lost 5 billion, 20,000 people were laid off, and finally, after trying to make this acquisition work for several years, in 2007, Daimler-Benz realized that this would not work, finally disposed of Chrysler to a private equity firm for a period of 6 billion. Now, I make it sound simplistic. There are other factors which are involved, which can be environmental factors, the timing, the recessionary context which came in, the other thing. So it is not my attempt at this stage to make it hugely complete and comprehensive, but highlight to you all the sorts of things which can go wrong. And when you look at the list, while there may be a few things which you could not have foreseen, it is not as if nothing could have been foreseen. We just have to become more sensitive and give a higher weightage and value to the intangibles associated with such relationships, such mergers, which we tend to overlook as we move forward. And these were the sorts of differences, unseen differences at a point in time, which resulted in the fact that it didn't work. But I'm going to move on from these two very high-profile cases which I talked about, and move on to an area closer home and talking about Hindustan Unilever. Now, having spent a little bit of time, I might, before you accuse me of doing so, let me say it myself. Maybe for coming here and risking talking to you and making a fool of myself, I'm entitled to 2 or 3 minutes of a commercial break. Yeah? And if you hear a little bit about Hindustan Unilever, treat it as my spiel about the organization which I love dearly and I've worked for the last 20 years. Yeah? So let me share with you a little bit about Hindustan Unilever and its philosophy, about who it is today, what it has become, and the role that consolidation has played out here, and the thinking behind the types of consolidation activity that we've had. We are a large organization, just under 16,000 crores, 15,000 employees, 2 out of 3 Indians buy our products and use our products regularly, a market cap which is over $11 billion, 70 manufacturing locations, and we've been in this country for over 75 years. That's our company. And we are who we are, with leadership across a whole lot of categories, arising through a series of things that we've done. And this series of things, in this series of actions which we've taken, mergers, acquisitions and disposals, has played a large part in terms of where we've reached today. And what I want to share with you is the philosophy behind what's driven our mergers and acquisitions over this period. One of it has been our purpose. What's our purpose? What's our mission? What's the reason for our existence? And the second bit is the philosophy with which we've been in this country for the last 75 years. We may have been a multinational which came into this country, but we've never thought of ourselves as a multinational. We've thought of ourselves as an Indian company and believed very strongly that what's good for India is good for us. If India progresses and prospers, we undoubtedly will. And this was not some philanthropic or charitable notion. It was in our enlightened self-interest to realize that it is impossible to have the future and progress of any corporate which operates in a society to be prospering if the society in which you live does not prosper. So the needs of your society and the needs of a corporate cannot be delinked over long periods of time. They will go hand in hand as we move forward, and you will ignore this at your peril. There may be short periods of time when you could manage to do one without the other. In the fullness of time, I have not seen a successful business in a failing society. It cannot happen. Yeah? So if you keep this in mind, we had a vision. Now the words to this vision have been given more recently, but the thinking behind it and the actions behind it have been consistent for 75 years, and I'll talk about it. And we genuinely believe that if it is good for India, it will be good for us in the long term. We also have a purpose, and that purpose is to add vitality to everyone's lives. And that means that we must meet the needs of nutrition, hygiene and personal care with brands that help people feel good, look good and get more out of life. Just keep these two things in mind. This is what we want to do through our brands, and we want to make sure that our actions are consistent with national needs, national priorities and national progress. Now when you look at this chart, it might be a little easier for you to start seeing the sorts of things which we've done. And while you may not be able to read the details of, I'm sorry if I'm coming in people's way, national needs at that point in time. Yeah? And you would see a bit of those too. I'm going to talk about a few cases to illustrate the differences which are there and where we are as a result of that. Yeah? The first one was a series of acquisitions which we had in ice cream. And these series of acquisitions led to us creating what was a large presence in the ice cream market. Why was this consistent with our purpose? Why was it consistent with Unilever's long-term interest? Unilever has a long global presence in ice cream. We had no presence in India. And we wanted to establish a category very quickly, establish a presence, capabilities, infrastructure, network in a very short period of time. Building an ice cream business from scratch, if we had started doing it, would have taken a long period of time. We did not want to wait that long, and we therefore went and acquired a series of players in order to get to this position, and we got close to about a 50 share of the total market in this. And that's what gave us a quick and immediate entry into a category which was of strategic importance to us because it was consistent with the purpose which we were in. The second story is a story where we acquired Tomco. Tomco was the Tata Oil Mills company, which was a Tata company, which was into soaps and detergents. And we acquired that company, again, with very strategic reasons. We had a strong presence in soaps and detergents already. We saw a very strong strategic case for the acquisition of Tomco. We had brands, and there had a few key brands, but even more importantly, we saw strong geographical complementarity in the pockets where they were very strong and the pockets where we were strong. We saw complementarity in the production capacities and the locations where the production capacities were there, and we saw arising out of all of this scale and synergy benefits. And we did this very, very quickly after liberalization. It was clear to us that till the early 90s, this space was not open. You couldn't do any of this. And we were fast off the blocks through the early 90s to do this, because if we hadn't done this, somebody else might have, and we could have lost this opportunity very quickly. Allowed us to get to market shares in excess of 50% in this category when we did this. The third example really is an example of plantations, and this is an example of divestment which we carried out in order to carry out what we think is consolidation of the business which we are in. Through an acquisition of Brook Bond which took place across Unilever, we got into plantation, because Brook Bond as a philosophy was a backwardly integrated company with plantations which supported the tea business which they were in. Now, in some of this, there is no right or wrong, and sometimes business goes through cycles when people say, you know what, it's great to be vertically integrated. At other times, people say it doesn't really make sense. Just like at times people say focus is important, other times they say diversification is important. So I'm not here to preach one or the other. I am here to basically share with you what the history of the thinking was and why we did what we did at that point in time, and what our beliefs is, and it works for us. It needn't work for everyone in this stage. We came to the conclusion very soon, for a variety of reasons, that the business which we were in was the business of running brands, building brands and meeting consumer needs. We also came to the conclusion that the technology which we had developed could enable us to service the consumer far better using a blend of teas than relying on tea coming through just 1 or 2 or 3 plantations which were coming along. And therefore, having a plantation did not mean that we would never have to go to auctions, we would never have to buy other stuff in other teas from other players. Also, the dilution of the tea marketing control order enabled us to get into partnerships, if we wish to, with many other plantations. So the changed regulatory context, the recognition of what our core business was, and even as just as importantly a recognition that a large part of the management of Hindustan Unilever never really understood what it took to run a plantation. A plantation business and managing a plantation and making money out of it is fundamentally different from running a fast-moving consumer goods company. And I think managers often make the mistake of believing a good manager is a good manager and therefore he will quickly and very easily translate his skills. Now, may be true, but we ignore and lose the fact that there is something called domain knowledge, domain expertise. And of course there is value for management skills, but there is just as much value for domain expertise which we had. Over a period of time, as this plantation business which had domain experts came in, when they became a part of a larger Hindustan Unilever, many of them did not see opportunities moving forward. Many of them did not see career opportunities. The senior management started getting distance from the people who actually ran the plantations, and over a period of time the connect, the feel, the understanding of this business started becoming weaker and weaker. There was just no way we could create value out of this. We therefore decided to divest it. We therefore decided to give it to somebody else for whom it was a serious consolidation. He was in that business. And for us, by virtue of removing what we thought was a non-core part of what we were doing, enabled us to have a more focused portfolio business, which in some ways was consolidation for us as well. Yeah. So that really is the example of how even a divestment can be a meaningful form of consolidation. I'm now going to touch upon just one example, a less fashionable example, a less talked about example, but the principles of this consolidation and principles of consolidation which you've heard about in more glamorous and exciting mergers and acquisition holds true even for what I'm going to talk about here. And this is about and creates just as much value and sometimes even more value with less risk than the mergers, acquisitions and divestments which we keep making. What is this? This is consolidation, which is what I call internal consolidation. Even within a large organization like Hindustan Unilever with 70 units and so many factories, we found that there were a series of activities which were carried out across every unit and every place. And we said, is it possible for us to build an expertise center? Is it possible for us, in the light of the new technology which exists, to centralize transactions, processes, accounting into one hub which will really become leading edge in the deployment of all of this. We pulled all of this together, so activity and the action was devolved and took place from many places, but control, accounting, processing was carried out through one central place. And in today's world, given technology, it is possible for us to do that. The value of all of that was, rather than having 70 to 100 different accounting units everywhere which required a certain, and you could never have so many outstanding people in each place. Consolidation allowed you to bring the best people to address the best issues in a standardized, harmonized manner, improving reliability, reducing cost, and dramatically improving the controls that we had over our operations without taking anything away. Having done that, there was a next stage which was obvious to us, and that was to say, now that we've created something like this, why should we be doing it? This sort of shared service cell, there are other companies whose business it is to run these operations, and therefore we divested 51% of this business which we had created to a company called Capgemini, and thereby benefiting from the global scale, global understanding, global processes which a company like Capgemini had, giving us further cost advantages and control advantages and effectiveness improvements which we had along the way. So here is an example of what I think is consolidation, but carried out in an internal organizational context, generating just as much value as some of the bigger ones actually do. So with those thoughts, I'm going to try and summarize what I've said over the last maybe 30 minutes or 35, 40 minutes or so, and then open it up to any comments, questions, or observations that you may have. The first thing I would say is really consolidation can have many meanings, and it has different meanings for different people. Disposal for one is acquisition for the other, and therefore it is consolidation in many ways. It need not be about the product portfolio. Consolidation can be about processes, it can be about systems as well. The key thing for us to remember as we think of consolidation is that consolidation must be guided by a certain core set of beliefs, values, strategic insight. It must be linked to your vision, it must be linked to your purpose, and it must be linked to your values. If consolidation is driven primarily through one single driving force, that size matters, the bigger the better, it is fraught with great risk. Most of us do not admit it, but somewhere in our subconscious there is this belief, and there is that if I just could become larger, I would become more efficient. Far from the truth. People do not recognize that there are economies of scale, there are diseconomies of scale which start coming in. And diseconomies of scale come in when you lose focus. So my only caution is, it's a great tool. Handle it with care, make sure that it is consistent to the vision, purpose and values. Keep in mind the fact that economies of scale are important, diseconomies do exist, and they are invisible, they are not easy to quantify. You will only experience them as you go along. The cultural dimension of integration again cannot be ignored, and I'm sure you're all alive to those aspects. Managing an integration is crucial. The first 12 months, and maybe I would argue the first 6 months in terms of what you do are crucial. How ready you are, how prepared you are, the nature of the team which you put in, the ability to think through all issues, understand business and put in what I call an A team for an A job. It doesn't matter where you come from, which company you came from. The best man for the best job. Most people do not have the objectivity and the fairness and the transparency and systems to recognize it. In most mergers there's a winner and a loser. The moment there is a winner and a loser, you have lost. This combined entity has lost. I haven't come across too many people who manage an acquisition with a win-win relationship where the acquired company is made to not feel low. The psychological impact of this and losing key people is underestimated in any financial modeling that you carry out. And lastly, I want to caution you about some of the pitfalls. Because a large part of what you heard, you say, yeah, that's known. Yet, why is it after all of nothing where I've said is rocket science? Why is it that after all of these things which are known over so many years, there's enough literature over this over so many years in terms of what goes wrong? Why is it that 70-80% of them do not create value? And here I can only say is what I call deal heat. As you go through this process of acquisition, you become emotionally attached to making that happen. Too much emotional energy gets committed, too much of our mind space gets committed, and as if that isn't enough, as you become senior and as you become older and you become bigger, you unfortunately start having bigger egos. Most deals fail because the ego comes in the way and stops you from walking away. Most deals fail because you then start building in, because of your ego, the best case scenarios for upside without accounting for the potential risks and downsides which can come in. And therefore risk analysis, sensitivity analysis is not done as rigorously as it needs to. The other aspects I've talked about in great detail, I don't want to spend any more time, which is the cultural aspects of what goes wrong. And that's the loss of morale, the lack of cultural integration which takes place. And the third aspect again which I've touched upon is economies of scale are easier to understand, diseconomies of scale are not easy to understand. In my experience over the last 20 years in this organization, I've grappled with one issue. And that one issue is how do you balance scale and focus? This is the perennial question for all managers at all points in time, and there is no easy answers. And the reason it is a tough question for all of us is because the benefits of scale can be quantified and put down into a spreadsheet. The potential loss of value because of lack of focus is not easy to do, it's a judgment. And there are very few brave managers who are willing to put their judgment ahead of what the financial models show you, and therefore say, maybe this shows that we should consolidate and go in with scale and combine these two further. My gut tells me that we will lose more out of this because of the softer aspects associated. It requires a brave and courageous man with real deep insight into business to be able to make calls like that, and most of us fail when it comes to this, and that is why history repeats itself again and again and again as we move forward. And lastly, the domain knowledge which I talked about, never ever underestimate. Don't have such an inflated ego where you feel because you've done one job well, you'll do the other job well. Don't have such a low opinion of what others have done in their field. And if you are humble enough and are grounded enough to acknowledge these and use this as a mirror for yourself when you get into any deal, I suspect that we would reduce the possibility, or certainly reduce the proportion of deals which go wrong. Deals will always go wrong. If you had a situation where only 5% of the deals didn't create value, I would feel worried as well. Because we aren't being adventurous enough. Because we aren't taking risks, sufficient risks. Because therefore we may be losing many opportunities to create value because we are conservative. So I'm not a person who advocates risk-free behavior as we move forward, but equally, when you have facts which tell you 80% of them do not create value and you ignore them, you're being foolish and stupid. And I don't think you're entitled to that, because in the end, this is not your money. This is shareholders' wealth which you're dealing with, and it is only your ego which you're pandering to. And these are the two things that you must always bear in mind before you move forward. Yeah? So that's really all that I thought I'll say to you. I've talked about all of this in considerable detail. And with those few words, I'm going to stop at this stage and leave the floor open to any of you if you have any questions, comments which you might wish to raise. Thank you all for your patient and indulgent hearing. Please. Thank you.
Inspiring words, and you truly are a mentor for most of us sitting here waiting to prove ourselves to the corporate world. I would request all the dignitaries to please come up on the dais. Dr. Bedekar, our chairman, Dr. P.M. Kelkar, our director, Dr. Guru Prasad Murthy, our director general, and our key speaker, Mr. Nitin Paranjape.
One minute, Dr. Vidya Bedekar.
Say a few words.
Well, friends, let me begin with this, that the whole intention and exercise to conduct such seminars, well, you have heard him. The most important point, if you are not marked, is our intention also is to have a role model in front of you. How little time you can take to deliver the maximum contents. And today we had the best example. Within 35 to 40 minutes, he has given us so much of value addition, so much of information, which needs probably a day or two to digest. So the body language, the articulation, the presentation, I would request students to see that when it comes to your presentation, follow him. There is no point of ego, we have to learn. Well, what he has said is very important. It is not the mega deals which necessarily should succeed. It's not necessarily also to see that two goods can do better good, not necessarily. There are many intricate, complicated and well-researched back office work to be done for any amalgamation and acquisitions. If they are done well, they succeed. If they are not done well, only by sheer name or sheer quantity or quantum scales, you don't win in the whole market. So we had a lot of things you have explained us, and now what we have to do is question and answer. So please go ahead. You can shoot questions now. Don't tell me you don't have any questions.
I'm delighted.
What is the scope of FMCG industry in emerging markets like Africa and Latin America? Yes.
I think I would say FMCG markets and FMCG industry has opportunity in all markets. It's not just Africa and Latin America. We often assume that these markets become mature, and when you recognize a few statistics, if I were to tell you, you would realize how much more opportunity there is for this industry in markets. When you asked about Africa, I'm presuming you mean in markets which are even less, some of them who are less developed than India. And what I want to say to you is that we think that the FMCG market in India is developed. I'm going to quote you a few statistics which will let you know how much more scope there exists. And you multiply that by a factor of 2, what I'm going to tell you, and that's the sort of opportunity which exists in Africa. Multiply that by about 0.8, because parts of Latin America are a little ahead of India in terms of the numbers which I'm going to tell you. That's about the scope which exists in Latin America. Okay? So I'm going to give you some this. If you take the detergents market, our consumption levels are 60% of China, and China is about 10 to 12 years ahead of us in all modeling work which we've done in terms of how markets are developing. In the area of shampoos, we are about 30% of China's consumption, which in the area of skincare markets, we are about 10% of China's consumption, and in the area of ice cream, we are about 10% of consumption. What it means is that the scope for these markets which I've talked about could be growing between 3 times to 10 times in many of these industries over the next 10 to 15 years. And now I've given you these statistics, apply them to Africa, which is even more than this, and about 70 to 80% of these numbers apply them to Latin America, and that should give you a sense of the scope which exists for growth and consumption of the FMCG markets in these places.
Sir, my question is that when HUL came to India, you said that you considered yourself as the Indian company, not a multinational company. So my question is, what alterations were made in HUL management culture to adapt to Indian environment?
The first thing we did applies to what short for Indianization, but we've had an Indian chairman for the last many decades that I can imagine. The earliest opportunity we realized the need to actually build Indian talent to develop a sensitivity with the real India. So that was action number 1. We set up a research center in this country to start understanding the requirements of Indian consumers and Indian markets many decades ago. That was the second action which was taken. The third action we did was to realize that despite recruiting Indian talent, the Indian talent we get still comes from urban centers and large cities. The India which we need to deal with is not the India which we see around us. 75% of the India lives in villages, and we had to deal with those people. So every person who joined this company as a management trainee, and I was one of them, was required to go and spend 2 months living in a village, not traveling to a village, but living in a village. Living in a village which did not have a road, which did not have electricity, and you stayed there and lived there to understand the life of what I would call the Bharat as different from India, and feel for the issues which they have, and therefore start doing something about it. What else did we do through our actions? There was a stage when the government wanted anyone which was a foreign company and a multinational to meet a certain obligation in terms of balance of payments, because we were a balance of payment starved nation. We got into exports in areas which had nothing to do with what Unilever did. We got into garments, we got into marine, we got into leather, we got into textiles, exporting these only so that we could generate foreign exchange and meet the national requirement of meeting a balance of payment criteria. So these are the sorts of things that you would get a sense of saying, through as life went on at different stages, we were alive to the requirements of the nation at that point in time and responded accordingly. Today, for example, we've divested many of these because they are not core to us, and balance of payment is no longer a national issue, and therefore we've divested them.
Is hitting the FMCG companies?
Hitting. Now, sorry?
Through which sector they are hitting? Because if the goods are the consumer goods, movable goods, the consumers' demand would not be decreasing. So then through which sector is hitting the FMCG companies?
No, are you saying is it hitting or is it aiding?
It's hitting.
So adverse impact. Yeah. So in fast-moving consumer goods, till date we have not seen the adverse impact in terms of consumer spending. And there are many reasons for this. It is our belief, for example, 70% of the country still lives in rural India. Over half our consumption comes from rural India today. It is our belief that these so-called economic crisis which we've seen, the subprime crisis, the liquidity crisis which we've had, is less likely to impact India and more importantly FMCG companies for a variety of reasons. First, less than 3 to 5% of Indian consumer households have an exposure to the banking industry and have got impacted by what's going on. That's point number one. Over 50% of our consumption and 70% of our people come from rural India. We believe that rural demand is unlikely to be affected by anything that goes on anywhere else in the world. Many reasons for this. A lot of money is pumped into rural India. The National Rural Employment Generation Scheme has pumped in a lot of money into rural India. The loan waiver scheme which the government ran has pumped in a lot of money and changed sentiment into rural India. Technology has led to better price realization and price discovery mechanisms, as a result of which the margin which the middleman made is beginning to come down. It hasn't disappeared, but is beginning to come down. As a result of which the rural farmer is realizing a slightly better price. Food grain prices actually went up through all of last year, as a result of which the rural farmer actually made more money. Input costs continued to be subsidized, as a result of which his cost remained low, his revenue and realization went up. All in all, for a variety of these reasons, the rural consumer was actually better off. Combine this with the fact that we had 3 to 4 years of good monsoon which we had, as a result of which he did not suffer. That's as far as consumer spending in FMCG is concerned. Having said that, if the economic downturn continues for a long period of time, there is no business which can be and no sector which can be completely insulated, and there may be a stage when the FMCG markets will also start seeing an impact, and the way it will happen is through down trading, choosing different brands, reducing consumption, reducing some discretionary choices which you had, and that's how it would hit us. Some of the other sectors have been hit. You would have seen the index of industrial production. The good news, however, is that consumer durables, which is the sector which had got hit for October, November, December, has actually shown very strong growths in the month of January, which we've seen. So that's, I think, the balance in terms of how the recessionary trend is going. My only comment here is that I would just caution everyone out here, and I say that in every industry forum, I have observed in my last 20 years that as far as sentiment is concerned, there is nothing like a stable equilibrium. The pendulum moves from one end to the other. On the 1st of January 2008, people behaved as if the unbridled optimism, nothing could ever go wrong. And by the end of the year, people behaved as if nothing could ever be right. Yeah. Now, life is not like that. The unbridled optimism was misplaced, and this doom and gloom scenario which we think of ourselves in is also misplaced. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and we must have the wisdom to see beyond the immediate sentiment created in the media and the immediate issues which are there, and to recognize the fundamentals. And in my judgment is that India will recover faster than the rest of the world. And we talk of a recession. India is not in a recession. India is likely to grow by 6%, 5%, 7%. That's the range which people talk about. 5% is still growth. Let's not forget that till 3 or 4 years ago, we never grew more than 5-6%. Just because we grew at 9% for the last 3 or 4 years, we start seeing 5% growth as a recession. It is not a recession. We are still likely to grow at 5%.
Maybe one more.
So, what are your views, or you would like to share about the subprime crisis going in the world nowadays?
I am not an expert on this subject. I think there were very many bright people who were involved in all of this, but I am a simple person with simple thinking, and my thinking tells me that when such a large number of very intelligent people go so horribly wrong, it is not to do with being more smart or being more intelligent. It is something to do with our behaviors and the drivers to our behaviors. The values with which we live, the criteria by which we judge success. When we live in a world when materialism and materialistic dimensions are the only criteria by which we start judging success, I'm afraid that common sense and judgment gets clouded. I'm afraid that we will make mistakes, and we are too smart to be able to even justify some of the decisions which we make, and therefore we will keep repeating those mistakes again and again. So my comment out here is I do not think any further laws are going to prevent any further crisis. After Enron, we had Sarbanes-Oxley and the most draconian acts which took place in the United States. We felt more regulation would solve our problem. It did not. Regulation does not shape character. Regulation does not shape values. And unless you have character, unless you have values, unless you have a belief that you will do what is right, the world unfortunately will keep having these issues again and again and again, and this is the price which we will pay for being misguided in our actions. That's all I can say.
Well, thank you, sir. And we are coming to an end of this session. And before I hand over my mic to Dr. Murthy, what he said at the end is very important. See, more regulations, or you cannot overcome the crisis by simply controlling it by means which are not within the domain of a human nature. Now, if you don't have a character, if you don't have a conviction, if you don't have a commitment to your own nation, here I nation means your own environment and your own people, nothing can change. Nothing can change. We are seeing it in America. There, as he says, many draconian laws are coming. Thanks to our government, still they are not following that mode of operations yet, but we are not very sure. I would say that such mentality, such mindsets are existing. Liberalization of industry has taken place, but I hope the same this thing is applied to education and many other fields if country has to progress. And the most important thing I feel what he has said about his is a multinational, but they have taken a care to see that it is an Indian company. Try to understand, it's a big message. I can just tell you, because you are very young, if you have seen the advertisement of Cadbury about 20 years back, which was a more westernized advertisement, and if you see the advertisement of Cadbury now, you know, they see a extended family where grandfather is there, father is there, and so many other family members are there. They have just want to communicate a message to you that this is an Indian company, this is an Indian ethos, this is an Indianness in Cadbury, that we are a part of you. So that's a beautiful idea for the advertiser. I'm not going to tell you some of the advertisements which are exactly opposite. They are trying to impose on you the westernness, the many other values which are not very familiar with you and me, and they have failed. Now, last but not the least, friends, as a doctor, my pharmacology teacher used to tell me that don't learn your pharmacology through your medical rapes. You must know, as a doctor, you must know your own pharmacology, and don't, the message was that they come as a marketing guys and they try to tell us only one side of the story. So as a doctor, we should know what is what and what is not. As a management students, of course, don't learn your management from advertisements and what is appearing in the media. It's something more deeper than that, and that is the reason why you are taking education here. Well, friends, you'll understand what I say. With these few words, I request Dr. Murthy to continue further.
I just want to give some messages to the students from this speech, the brilliant speech. It speaks volumes. First is brand equity of Hindustan Unilever and Jamnalal Bajaj, and of course the Paranjape that is there in him. Second, very important message for the student. See, you may get fascinated by what we teach you in the class, in finance classes. NPV is positive, IRR is higher than cost of capital, so go ahead. It is not like that. Hard skills and soft skills, that's what he said. The hard skill and the soft skills, the cultural issues have to be taken into account. And mark one particular sentence which he said, which we use in the classroom in Jamnalal Bajaj and wherever I teach. Decision making starts where the formula ends. The intangibles have to be assessed and the imponderables have to be evaluated. I think this message is drummed almost in every class towards the end in management accounting and business finance, so that you are not overawed by the formulas that we present in the class, you see. So please remember this, it's not just formulas. Formulas don't drive business. Formulas are a guide or aid to business. The rest of it is gut, and you must have the courage to articulate your gut when there is a situation. It's a very important message we should carry from his speech. That is, the students, please note. Thank you.